The cold, infinite expanse of space stretched out before Captain Kalen Vance as he stood at the helm of the Ravager. His ship, battered and patched together from scraps of metal and old technology, cut through the void, a ghost ship of its own, in the lawless fringes of the galaxy. The stars outside shimmered with distant, unreachable light, but Kalen couldn't feel the awe they should have inspired. He'd seen too many stars flicker out in his lifetime to waste his time admiring them. Kalen wasn't the same man he used to be. Once he had served in the Federation Navy, a promising officer with a reputation for leading difficult missions to success. But that was before the Astral Jackal mission, before everything fell apart. Now Kalen made a living as a privateer, smuggling, hunting bounties, navigating dangerous parts of space where the law didn't reach. He had a small ragtag crew, and the Ravager was his home, a place where he could escape the memories, the mistakes, and the ghosts of his past. But no matter how far he traveled, no matter how many sectors he crossed, those ghosts always followed. He had made peace with it, or at least that's what he told himself. Peace was the kind of lie you told when you didn't want to face the truth. The truth was Kalen hadn't moved on, and that truth was about to catch up with him. It started with a message, an old frequency, encrypted, buried in a part of the ship's communication system Kalen hadn't touched in years. It buzzed to life in the dead of night, a whisper that broke through the silence. Kalen was sitting alone in his quarters when he heard it. The Astral Jackal is no longer a ghost. It hunts again. His breath caught in his chest. The message was brief, but the name was enough to tear open a wound he had long tried to bury. Alex Gorman, his closest friend, his comrade on the Jackal, who had disappeared years ago when the ship was lost. They had both been part of the crew sent to investigate, a strange anomaly. But the mission had gone wrong, so terribly wrong. The Jackal had vanished into the unknown, and Kalen had been left behind, the sole survivor. Or so he had thought. Now Alex was alive, or at least something claiming to be him was reaching out. Kalen couldn't ignore it, not this time. The message wasn't just a distress call, it was a lure, pulling him back to the one place he swore he'd never return, the wreckage of the Astral Jackal. He stood up from his chair, staring out at the empty space ahead. For the first time in years, he felt the old pull, the need to find the truth, to face what had happened. The weight of the decision crushed down on him, but there was no turning back now. Alex had left a trail, and Kalen was going to follow it no matter where it led. With a sigh, he turned toward the bridge, his mind already racing through the steps. He would need to assemble a crew. This mission would be dangerous, and he couldn't do it alone. He would need Sarah, the engineer, Cade, the sharpshooter, and Lyra, the spiritualist who believed in things Kalen had long since dismissed. They would follow him into the dark once more, into the heart of the Astral Jackal. The Ravager drifted in the silent void, its engines humming softly as Kalen stood in the dim light of the bridge, staring at the encrypted message on the screen. His fingers hovered over the controls, hesitating. The words on the display, the name Alex Gorman, made it feel like the room was closing in on him. He'd spent years trying to forget the Astral Jackal, to forget the failure, the lost comrades, the death of the mission. But now the past was coming back, and it had a name: Alex. His heart thudded against his chest. He couldn't ignore it. No matter how much he tried, the ghosts of his past wouldn't let him go. "Captain," came Sarah's voice, breaking his trance. The young engineer stepped onto the bridge, her face lit by the glow of the ship's control panels. She was sharp, always focused on the task at hand, but even she could sense something was off. "You look like you've seen a ghost. What's going on?" Kalen slowly turned toward her, his gaze steady, but distant. "The Astral Jackal isn't just a ghost ship anymore," he said, his voice low. "It's hunting again." Sarah frowned, but she didn't need to ask. She'd heard the stories, just like everyone else in the fringes of space. The Jackal had disappeared years ago under mysterious circumstances, its entire crew presumed dead. Its wreckage never found, but Kalen knew better. He'd been there. He knew the truth was far darker than anyone could imagine. Someone's out there, Kalen continued, almost to himself. Someone from my past. And I'm going to find them. Sarah's fingers hovered over the ship's console, tapping a few keys. You think this is real? We're talking about a ghost ship, Kalen. There's no way it could just pop back up. No, it's real, Kalen replied, his voice hardening. And I need you to help me track it. Sarah hesitated. That thrived in the depths of distant gas giants. They had their own intuition, a sense honed by centuries of spacefaring that human minds simply could not fathom. Zarkov's sharp eyes flicked toward the walls, sensing the presence of something, beyond the ship's hollow silence. Mara's instinct screamed for her to turn back. There were too many things that didn't make sense. The strange readings from the ship's core, the absence of a crew, the inexplicable atmosphere that surrounded them. It all felt too familiar, like a story they had been told too many times. The Revenant wasn't just a ship. It was something more, something alive, something that had been waiting for them. The deeper they ventured, the stronger the feeling became. This ship wasn't abandoned, it was waiting for them. In the distance they heard it, a low hum, a pulse, a heartbeat. The Crimson Revenant had been waiting for them. The humming grew louder, vibrating through the walls of the ship, and for a moment, it felt like the Revenant itself was alive. The pulse resonated through the air as if the ship were responding to their presence, aware of their every move. Every step Mara and her crew took echoed back to them, but the sound wasn't quite right. It felt distorted, warped. The air was thick with an unnatural pressure, and the faintest whisper seemed to linger on the edges of their hearing, too soft to comprehend, but strong enough to send chills crawling down their spines. Mara glanced over her shoulder at her crew, seeing the uncertainty in their eyes. They had come prepared for the unknown, but this was something beyond anything they had ever anticipated. The Revenant had never felt like a ship. It felt like a living entity, a sprawling organism that thrived on something darker, more sinister. As they moved deeper into the ship, their footsteps slowed. The walls, made of a dark, iridescent material, seemed to shift in the faint light, almost as though the ship itself was breathing. They passed corridors lined with data terminals, their screens blank, save for the occasional flash of erratic code. Something was tampering with the ship's systems, and it wasn't clear whether it was the ship itself or something more dangerous. It's a trap, Soren muttered, glancing over his shoulder nervously. His eyes darted around as if expecting the ship's walls to collapse on him. His normally confident demeanor had cracked, replaced by the creeping terror that the Revenant wasn't merely empty. It was conscious. Zarkov, walking just ahead, halted, their alien senses sharper than any human's. Their glowing eyes narrowed, and they extended one long, clawed hand toward the corridor. The ship is not dead. It's waiting. Mara didn't speak. She could feel it too. The weight of the ship's consciousness pressing in on her, almost suffocating her. The ship was aware of their intrusion, and the hum that now filled the air seemed to be a response to their presence, a pulse that synchronized with their every move. They reached a large door at the end of the hall, its surface marked with strange symbols and worn patterns that looked more like the language of an ancient civilization than anything modern. As the crew gathered around the door, Mara approached cautiously. The hum grew louder here, vibrating against her chest as if it were trying to push her back. Her hand hovered over the door's control panel, hesitant. "We should turn back," Soren said, his voice tight, and there was a trace of fear in his eyes. "Something's not right here, Captain." Mara's gaze lingered on the strange symbols. They were different from anything she had seen in her studies, a language that seemed to transcend space itself. But there was something familiar about it, something that tugged at the back of her mind. It felt like an invitation, one that was meant for her, one that had waited centuries for this moment. She pressed a button on the control panel. The door opened with a low, groaning sound, and for the first time, they saw what lay beyond. The chamber was vast, a hall that stretched farther than the eye could see. In the center of the room, Suspended in a web of what looked like energy tendrils was an object, dark and metallic, radiating an eerie, pulsating glow. It hovered in midair, surrounded by an invisible force field that made the air around it shimmer and distort. The object was unmistakable, an ancient relic, a core of some kind, surrounded by an energy field that defied the laws of physics. Mara felt her heart race as the realization hit her. This was it. This was the heart of the Revenant. It wasn't just a ship. It was a vessel for something far more ancient, something that could change everything they knew about the universe. But as she stepped closer, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically and the humming intensified. It wasn't just the hum of the ship anymore, it was a voice, deep and resonant, echoing in the minds of the crew. Leave. Now. The voice came in a... The air in the Ravager grew heavier, charged with the same unsettling energy Kalen remembered from the Jackal's last days. He could feel the presence of the ship, a consciousness that existed in every corner of it, watching them, waiting. Prepare. To board, Kalen ordered, his voice steady but filled with determination. The crew nodded, each one silently steeling themselves for what lay ahead. Kalen led the way to the docking ramp. The air outside was cold, oppressive. It felt as though the universe itself had shrunken, closing in around them as they stepped into the Jackal's eerie interior. The corridors were narrow, the metal walls sleek but somehow wrong, as if they hadn't been touched in years. The dim lighting cast long shadows and strange faint sounds echoed from within, as though the ship were alive, breathing in its own forgotten dark. "We're not alone," Cade murmured, his hand on his weapon. The sharp-eyed mercenary was always on edge, and this place, this cursed ship, was unsettling even to him. "No kidding," Sarah muttered, her voice tight with anxiety. She was scanning the walls with her handheld scanner, but there was no readout, no life signs, no signs of any technology running, just an eerie, unnatural silence. Lyra, who had been unusually quiet so far, stepped forward, her eyes closed in concentration. "The Jackal is calling. It's waiting. It wants us here." Kalen turned to her. "What does that mean?" "It's not just a ship. It's something older, something that's grown beyond its original purpose," Lyra explained softly. "It's feeding, and we are its prey." Kalen didn't have time for spiritual riddles. His focus was on finding answers. And finding Alex. "Let's move," he snapped. As they navigated deeper into the ship, the atmosphere grew heavier, oppressive. The walls pulsed with a strange energy, and the deeper they went, the more it felt as though the ship were pressing in on them, watching them. A shiver ran down Kalen's spine, but he kept his resolve. He'd come here to find the truth, not to let fear stop him. They reached what appeared to be the central hub of the Jackal, a cavernous room filled with abandoned consoles, their screens cracked and shattered. But something wasn't right. The equipment looked too advanced for a ship that had been lost for years. And then they saw it. In the center of the room, a figure stood, back turned to them. His silhouette was unmistakable. "Alex," Kalen whispered, his breath catching in his throat. The figure didn't respond. It remained perfectly still, like a statue, almost too still. Kalen stepped forward, his voice a mixture of hope and caution. "Alex? Is that really you?" The figure slowly turned. It was Alex, but it wasn't. His face was gaunt, hollow, eyes glowing with an unnatural light. His once familiar features were twisted, distorted by something that had taken root deep inside him. "It's not him, Kalen," Sarah said, her voice laced with horror. "He's something else." Alex, or whatever had become of him, spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't have come here, Kalen, I warned you. The Jackal has chosen us. We are its keepers now, and you will join us." A chill ran through the crew as the words sank in. The Jackal hadn't just taken its crew. It had changed them, turned them into something far worse. And now it was after them too. "You've become part of the ship," Kalen said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You're not Alex anymore." Alex's twisted smile stretched across his face. "I am the ship now. We are one, and I will not let you leave." Before Kalen could react, the walls around them began to shift, groaning and creaking as if the ship itself were coming alive. The air thickened, charged with a dark energy that made it hard to breathe. The very space around them seemed to warp, folding in on itself. Kalen's mind raced. He needed to act. Fast. They were outnumbered, outmatched, and surrounded by something far older and far more powerful than anything they had encountered. Cade raised his weapon, but the atmosphere was growing unstable. Sarah pulled out her tools, trying to tap into the ship's systems, but the energy from the Jackal's core interfered with everything. "We need to get out," Sarah said urgently. "This place, it's changing us." But Kalen wasn't going to leave. Not yet. "We're not running. We're finding out what happened to Alex, and we're ending this." The ship continued to pulse with energy, and the crew braced themselves for what would come next. The true danger of the astral jackal was only beginning to reveal itself. It was more than just a haunted wreck. It was a living entity, and now it had set its sights on Kalen and his crew. The walls of the astral jackal seemed to close in on them, the pulsating energy from its core reverberating through the very air they breathed. Kalen's heart raced, his breath quickening as he faced the twisted form of Alex. The man who had once been his friend, his comrade in arms, was now something far worse, something that had been corrupted by the ship, bound to its malevolent will. "We're not here to join you, Alex," Kalen said, his voice steady, though his mind raced with uncertainty. He couldn't afford to hesitate now, not with everything on the line. His crew was in danger, and the truth about the astral jackal had only become more horrifying with each passing minute. Alex tilted his head, his twisted smile never faltering. "You never understood, Kalen. The ship has chosen. We are its keepers, and you will be too. You came here to find answers, but all you've found is the inevitable. The astral jackal is not a ship. It is a gateway, a way to transcend, to become something greater." The walls around them groaned, shaking as though the ship were alive, feeding off the dark energy that crackled through it. Kalen could feel, it too, the oppressive weight of the jackal's power. The ship's influence stretched beyond mere technology. It was something ancient, something eldritch. The crew was being suffocated, trapped by the ship's unholy will. "Kalen," Sarah gasped, pulling at his arm. "We can't fight this. We need to shut it down. It's too powerful. The ship is alive, and it wants us to join it. We can't win this battle with guns or tech. We have to destroy the core." Kalen nodded, his mind already calculating the next move. The jackal's influence was growing stronger by the second. The crew's lives were on the line, and if they didn't act fast, they would all be swallowed up by the ship's insidious force. "We don't have a choice," Kalen said, turning to Cade. "We're going to the core. Sarah, can you bypass the systems?" Sarah's face was pale, her hands trembling as she looked at the walls of the ship, now contorting like living flesh. "I'll try. But it's not going to be easy. The jackal is in everything. Its systems, its structure. We're walking into the heart of it." "Then let's move," Kalen said, his voice resolute. The team began to move toward the heart of the ship, the only way to end the nightmare and free themselves from its grip. The corridors twisted around them, impossible angles and shifting walls that seemed to taunt their every step. The jackal wasn't just a ship. It was a maze, a sentient labyrinth that fought against them at every turn. The deeper they went, the more the ship began to feel like a living thing, the walls pulsing as if it had a heartbeat. "We're getting close," Kalen said, his hand tightening around his blaster. They rounded the final corner, and there it was, the core of the astral jackal. It was massive, an otherworldly structure at the center of the ship, throbbing with energy, sending out waves of oppressive force. The air shimmered around it, distorting like heat rising from a fire. But it wasn't just the core that caught Kalen's attention. It was what surrounded it. A swarm of figures, distorted versions of the jackal's original crew. Alex stood at the front, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light, a twisted expression of both madness and serenity on his face. "You can't stop it." Alex's voice boomed, amplified by the ship's unnatural resonance. "We are the keepers now. You cannot destroy what has already become eternal." Kalen's grip tightened on his blaster. "We're not here to fight you, Alex. We're here to end this madness." The Jackal's distorted crew moved forward, their bodies writhing as if caught between two worlds. The ship had taken everything from them, everything they had been, and turned them into something unrecognizable. But Kalen wouldn't give up. He couldn't. "Move!" Kalen barked, and the crew rushed forward, weapons drawn. The Jackal's defenders lashed out, their movements unnatural, as though they were controlled by the very ship itself. The crew fought back, but they were outnumbered. Cade fired, each shot carefully aimed, but the figures kept coming as if they were endless. Sarah, using her knowledge of the ship's systems, tried to breach the core's defenses, but the ship's systems fought back, an invisible barrier of energy preventing her from getting close. Lyra, sensing the ship's power, stepped forward, her voice a chant that resonated in the air. The words she spoke seemed to echo, vibrating with an otherworldly cadence. "Lyra, what are you doing?" Kalen shouted, but Lyra's eyes were closed in deep concentration. "Lyra!" She spoke again, louder this time, and Kalen could feel the air around him crackle with the intensity of her words. A wave of force surged from her, and the distorted crew faltered, if only for a moment. It was enough. "Now, Sarah," Kalen shouted. Sarah ran forward, her fingers flying over the control panel that guarded the core. Sparks flew as the systems resisted, but Sarah was relentless. With a final desperate push, she bypassed the core's defenses, and the ship's dark power crackled. "I've got it," Sarah yelled, just as a surge of energy shot out from the core, blasting the crew back. The Jackal's defenders collapsed, their forms disintegrating into ash as the core's energy was shut down. But the battle wasn't over. The ship was dying, and it fought back with everything it had left. The corridors twisted and warped as the walls groaned, the Jackal's death throes shaking the very foundations of reality. Kalen's eyes met Alex's one last time. The ship's influence was fading, but there was nothing left of Alex to save. The man Kalen had known was gone, replaced by something that could never be fixed. "I'm sorry, old friend," Kalen whispered, his voice hoarse. "But you were never supposed to be part of this." With a final, heart-wrenching scream, Alex's form collapsed into nothingness as the Jackal's influence crumbled. The core exploded in a blinding flash of energy, ripping through the ship and destroying the malevolent entity that had taken control of it. The astral Jackal was no more. The blinding explosion of energy that ripped through the ship was unlike anything Kalen had ever felt. It was as if time and space themselves had torn apart, unraveling in an instant. The ship, once a vast and mysterious entity, crumbled into a shell of its former self. The dark energy that had suffocated Kalen and his crew was now dissipating, replaced by the cold, familiar stillness of space. Kalen staggered, his body still vibrating from the shockwave. But he steadied himself and looked around. The Ravager had been pulled into the debris field, the ship groaning under the strain of the blast, but it was alive. They were alive. For the moment, that was all that mattered. Sarah was already at her station, her fingers flying over the controls as she worked to stabilize the ship. "We've got a hole in the hull, but we're still intact. I'll patch it up, but we're going to need to get out of here fast." Cade, his face bloodied but determined, walked up behind Kalen, his weapon still drawn, though no longer aimed at anything. "We made it," he said, his voice rough but relieved. "But I can't shake the feeling that we didn't really win. This thing, whatever it was, it's still out there somewhere, and we're just lucky it didn't kill us." Kalen nodded grimly. Cade wasn't wrong. The astral Jackal might have been destroyed, but the horrors it had unleashed weren't so easily forgotten. They had faced something older than the galaxy itself, something that couldn't be wiped away with a single shot or explosion. Kalen knew this wouldn't be the last time the galaxy saw such a force. "Let's not talk about what comes next, Cade," Kalen replied, his voice quiet but firm. "For now, let's just get out of here." The ship's systems flickered, back to life as Sarah rerouted the power to their engines. The crew didn't speak much as the Ravager turned away from the wreckage of the Jackal and began its journey back toward the safety of known space. The tension between them had eased slightly, but the silence was heavy with the weight of what they had just experienced. They had lost so much. Alex was gone. Nothing more than a twisted shadow of the man Kalen had once called his friend. The crew of the Astral Jackal had become nothing more than a warning, a ghostly testament to the ship's dark power. And yet in some way Kalen felt the loss of Alex as his own failure. He had promised to return for him, to bring him home. But what had he found? A hollow shell, a man who had been consumed by something far beyond him. "I should have done something sooner," Kalen muttered to himself, his voice barely a whisper. He hadn't saved Alex. He hadn't saved any of them. Lyra, who had remained quiet until now, stepped up beside him. Her eyes were distant, almost knowing. "You did what you could," she said softly. "There are some things we aren't meant to save. Some things are already lost before we even know they're gone." Kalen looked at her, her words settling in his chest. She was right, of course. There were some things beyond their control. And yet the weight of Alex's death, his failure, still hung heavy on him. It always would. As the Ravager drifted through the silent void, Kalen turned his gaze toward the distant stars, where a future he couldn't quite envision awaited. The journey had taken everything from him, his past, his friend, his peace of mind. But there was still something left inside him. A drive to keep moving forward, to keep fighting, to keep surviving. He wasn't sure where it would lead, but he knew he couldn't stop. The crew of the Ravager had been through hell together, and they had survived. That was something, at least. And for now, that was enough. The Ravager continued its slow drift toward known space, its engines humming softly as it cut through the void. The silence inside the ship was broken only by the low murmur of the crew tending to their duties. Kalen sat alone in the galley, staring out at the stars. The vast emptiness of space had always been something he could both fear and embrace, but now, consequence, and now she had to live with it. The crew was silent around her, each one lost in their own thoughts, struggling to process what they had just endured. Soren sat hunched over in his seat, staring at the data screens, his hands shaking, as he ran through the diagnostics over and over. The numbers didn't make sense. They were back in their own universe, but something was different. The readings didn't match what they knew to be possible. "I don't understand," Soren muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're here, but we shouldn't be." Zarkov's alien presence loomed beside him, silent as if contemplating the same enigma. Their species had evolved beyond mere physical form, existing as part of the cosmic flow. Yet even they were struggling to understand what they had witnessed. They had felt the entity's presence, the incomprehensible vastness of it, and now that it was gone, they too were left with a lingering question. What had they become? "We are not the same," Zarkov said softly, their voice carrying an odd resonance as though it had been altered by what they had experienced. "Neither are you, Captain." Mara's eyes flickered toward them, a knowing ache in her chest. "No," she agreed, her voice distant. "We're not." It was more than just the knowledge they had unlocked, more than the cosmic secrets they had brushed against. It was something else, something deeper, perhaps even irreversible. They had entered a realm where humanity's understanding of reality was no longer sufficient. The Revenant had been a key, and they had unlocked something powerful, something terrifying. It was as if the universe had opened its eyes to them, and now they could never return to the life they had known. "We survived," Mara finally said, her voice breaking the silence. "We're back." But the words felt hollow. They were back in the safety of their ship, but they weren't truly safe. The Revenant's final moments had left a crack in the fabric of the universe, one that none of them could ignore. They had glimpsed what lay beyond, and now it was a part of them, an indelible mark on their souls. And though they were no longer in the dark void, the memory of that place, the feeling of being a small part of something so much larger, would never leave them. "We have to tell someone," Soren said, though there was no certainty in his words. "We have to warn them." Mara turned to him, her expression unreadable. Warn them? Warn them about what? The secrets they had uncovered were not something that could be shared with the rest of humanity. The power that the Revenant had connected them to, this cosmic intelligence, was beyond comprehension. Even if they could explain it, who would believe them? Who could understand? Her gaze drifted out the window, past the stars, to the infinite darkness that stretched before them. There was no going back. The universe had changed in ways that no one could predict, and now it was up to them to decide how to move forward. "We don't warn them," Mara said quietly. "Not yet. Not until we understand what this all means." The silence stretched again, heavy with the weight of their shared understanding. They had been given a gift, or perhaps a curse, that they had no hope of fully comprehending. But they had been chosen, and now they had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Mara's mind raced. There were so many questions left unanswered. What had happened to the Revenant? What was the entity? What did it mean for humanity, and for the future of the universe itself? There were no easy answers. The choices before them were vast, stretching out in every direction, and each path seemed just as uncertain as the last. "We need to find the answers," Mara said finally, "for ourselves, and for the rest of humanity. We can't turn away from this." But the uncertainty hung heavy, in the air. What they had encountered was just the beginning. The universe was far larger, far more complex than they had ever imagined, and they were now part of something that could change everything. The hum of the ship's engines, once a comforting sound, now felt like a reminder of the fragility of their situation. They were alone in this vast, uncharted territory, and whatever came next would be shaped by their decisions. The future, like the stars, stretched out before them, endless, filled with both promise and danger. Epilogue sequel hook. The Resolute continued its journey, drifting through the darkness of space. The crew had changed, and so had their understanding of the universe. They were no longer simply explorers. They were something more, something connected to a force far beyond their comprehension. As they approached the next star system, a strange signal began to emerge from the depths of space. It was faint, barely detectable, but it was unmistakable. The message was simple, yet chilling. "We are waiting." Mara stood before the communications console, her fingers trembling as she reached for the controls. Her